this tree. The tree up here represents your problems, but the problems are not the problem. And so whatever things you fill in on these lines, those things aren't the problems. They are manifestations of whatever's going on in the root system. And so, get the right one here. And so what I want to do is review just very quickly what we covered in the 2 hours, hour and a half to 2 hours last night. What is the first and primary cause of root rot? Okay. We're born in a condition called dead to God. Now there's a lot of other theological terms that we could use to describe this, but I go with this simply because it best describes, I think, the condition that people find themselves in. They're not as bad as they can possibly be. It's just that we're in a condition that we're dead to God, and because we're dead to God, we are also in a condition of being what? We're self-centered. Doesn't mean that you're as bad as you can possibly be, but every baby born into this world is a self-centered human being, which means that we are not God-centered, we are not others-centered, we are focused on ourselves. And our desire is to get our deepest needs of love and security and affirmation and acceptance and safety, get those met outside of the one place that we're supposed to get met, and that is in the realm of our spirit man, which is dead to God. Our body is alive, our soul is alive, mind, will, and emotions, but our spirit is dead. And that's the condition that we come into the world. Now, let me just make and we'll develop this more tonight and tomorrow. A lot of people say, yeah, but I'm no longer dead to God. And I would say that's absolutely true. If you're in Christ, you're no longer dead to God. We'll develop that more tonight. The problem is you spend how many years developing a system of coping tools trying to get your deepest needs met from the outside in. And there's a reason why it says in Romans 12:1 and 2 that we're supposed to be renewed in the spirit of our mind. Because the truth of the matter is our mind, will, and our emotions are still under the residue, still under the influence of our old ways of coping, feeling, and choosing. I'm going to develop that tonight. So even if you are a believer, and I'm guessing from looking at you, most of you are, we still have all sorts of old ways of coping, feeling, and choosing that are connected to our old way of living. And because of that, we live out of a self-centered condition. I am one choice away at any given time from choosing, instead of choosing the Spirit, choosing myself. One choice away every moment of the day. And so that puts us in a situation in which we don't judge our thoughts and our emotions. Many of you were traumatized by the revelation that I thought of stabbing a woman in the face yesterday. If you know me long enough, you know that's pretty tame, actually, for what can go through my brain. And what I've found is if I don't judge my thoughts and my emotions, I can buy into all sorts of crazy things. And so can you. And so one of the biggest things we buy into that is not true is a way of viewing ourselves. We have what we call a controlling identity. And this controlling identity does exactly that over the course of our life. If we don't get a different identity, and if we don't choose to see ourselves in a different identity, again, moment by moment as we go through the day, we will be controlled by this identity. And one of your assignments was to write down your 5 worst hurts, or however many, up to 5 that you could think of. And we're going to put those on a grid, actually, tomorrow. But those things factor into the identity that you have, how you see yourself. And the problem is never the problem. I would say never the problem, but vast majority, 99.9% of the time, the problem is not the problem. And the crisis or the event is not the problem. The reason that we cycle in this cycle back into our problem and struggle with it is because of our worst identity. Anytime anything strips you naked, anytime anything takes you down to what you hope you're not, but deeply suspicious that you are, anytime that happens, you've got a choice. You're going to either see yourself in that and cycle back into your coping tools. We all do this. Or you're going to see yourself as God says you are. And so we're going to start here tonight with the concept of why, if we have this new identity, why don't we live out of it? What are the things that we turn to instead of this? The second source of root rot, I want to introduce by telling you real briefly an Old Testament story. There were two sisters. The first source of root rot is we're dead to God. There is something that happens because of that. And this is the second source of the root rot in our lives. There were two sisters. One was named Rachel, and one was named Leah. And Rachel and Leah were married to Joseph. And Joseph worked for their father for many, many, many years. Now, we don't need to go into all the story about how he got the two wives and all that. But the point of the story is they lived with Jacob for many, many years while he was basically an indentured servant to his father-in-law. And they knew two things. They knew that their husband, Jacob, worshipped Jehovah. And they also knew that their father, Laban, was a pagan. He worshipped other gods. Okay? Now, they watched God, Jehovah, work in their husband's life, and basically by the time they were getting ready to move, he owned the farm. He had all the good livestock. He had basically everything. And they knew that Jehovah, their husband's God that he worshipped, had provided that for him. They also had watched Laban's gods, multiple gods, and they hadn't been able to do a thing for him. He lost the farm. So they understood that Jehovah was a God that could be counted on and that provided for you and that was real. They also had observed that Laban, their father's gods, couldn't do a thing for him. All right? That's the background to the story. When they went to leave, went to move away, they kind of did it under the cover of night. And when they moved away, Rachel went into her father's tent and stole the family idols and then trucked off with them. And, of course, they had this big brouhaha a little bit later. But the point of the story is she, knowing that these gods had never actually helped her father much at all, knowing that, she still went in and stole them. She knew that Jehovah was the one who helped. She knew that the other gods had never helped. She still went and stole them. So here's the question coming out of the story. Why did she do that? I mean, there's possibly a lot of reasons. People are psychologically very complex. But why would you, knowing that it couldn't help you, why would you go steal it and take it anyway? Anybody have any ideas? Okay. Why? If we know they don't help, why? Okay, just in case Jehovah doesn't do what you want, you can still go back and pray to the other idol, even though in your insanity you know it's probably not going to help a lot. Maybe on the outside this time it will. The other thing is they're very familiar. It's a funny thing about idols. We might know they don't help us, but they're familiar. And so we keep running back to them. And that's what we want to talk about tonight. The Israelites were an interesting bunch. They, where are we at here? Am I going the right way? The Israelites started out in Egypt, and in the Bible, Egypt is a picture of the non-believer. Egypt is a picture of being under the curse of sin and not redeemed. Okay, so they were in slavery in Egypt, and it took them just a few days, 11 days' journey actually, to get over here to the edge of the Promised Land. But on the edge of the Promised Land, they turned around, they forsook their idols, they decided the Promised Land was too tough, and so based on that, in relying on themselves, they wandered around in the desert for another 40 years. And the Promised Land is not a picture of dying and going to heaven. The Promised Land is a picture for the believer on earth of entering into everything that God has for us. The wilderness isn't simply our journey on earth. The wilderness is a believer who keeps wandering around trying to fix life on his own or her own and not living in the power and the grace and the rest. The Promised Land is a picture of the rest that is promised to believers. And so what they were trying to do is they were trying to be a plant that is living in a vase, a branch that's living in a vase. You know, as soon as you cut a branch off, it begins to die. The only way a branch can continue to live if it's actually in the vine thriving. And the Israelites were like a branch in a pot, trying to live while they were dying. And that's why they wandered around in the desert for so long. So what we want to do is talk about tonight How idols work, because the second cause of root rot is that we have idols. Now, if you want a current way of saying it, we have coping tools. Whatever your coping tool is, that's an idol. An idol, by definition, is anything that we turn to other than Jesus to fix our situation or feel better about ourselves. Now, that is not to say that there aren't actions you take and all that kind of stuff, but the truth of the matter is we turn to those things as plan A and only to God as plan B or C or D when all the other things fail. That's a definition of an idol. An idol is anything you turn to feel better about yourself or to try to fix your situation first other than Jesus. And so what we want to do is identify idols and talk about why they have such a hold on us. What's the dynamic of how idols work? Christian growth is not imposed through the choices that we make. Christian growth is exposed through the choices that we make. Say that not the chores. It's not imposed through the chores that we do. Said that wrong. It's not imposed through chores, through a list. That's not the Christian life. Christianity is exposed by the choices that we make because Christianity is a person that is already in you. Christian growth is not initiated through a bunch of chores. Get a do list, check off the do list. Christian growth is participating in his life by our choices. That's where Christian growth comes. Christian growth is participating in his life by our choices. And God willing, we'll flesh that out over the next in the next hour or two. Now, how do idols work? Well, the temple in the Old Testament, or the tabernacle, is a pattern that God works in over and over again. If you'll notice, the temple or the tabernacle is very similar to how a human being is made. Human being is a body and a soul and a spirit person. With our body, we challenge the environment. With our soul, as our mind, will, and our emotions. And with our spirit, we have interaction with God. And 1 Thessalonians 5:23 talks about human beings in these terms. Now, the pattern in the Old Testament is that there was an outer court, there was a holy place, and there was a holy of holies. In the outer court, any man could come into the outer court to make his sacrifices. Only the average priest or the high priest could go into the holy place, the realm of the soul, mind, will, and emotions, and only the high priest once a year could go into the Holy of Holies, which is where the Ark of the Covenant was. And in the spiritual life of the priest was confined to these two areas. Only the high priest could go into the Holy of Holies, and that only one time a year to offer one atonement sacrifice. So the life of the Old Testament priest was restricted to the outer court, and it was restricted to the Holy of Holies, or the holy place, the second room, the first room in the tabernacle. And in the flesh, the carnal believer is a person, or a non-believer as well, is an individual who cannot enter the Holy of Holies. They enter only, either their life is restricted either to the outer court or to the holy place. The priest, in other words, served God in the limited power of the flesh. That's the picture in the Old Testament, and it's something that then transfers into the New Testament. Carnal believers are like the Old Testament priest. You can draw pictures in here. Carnal believers are like the Old Testament priest. Now, a carnal believer, the word carnal is from Latin, which means flesh. So we're talking about a fleshly believer, not a person with skin, but a person who is living out of their old ways of coping and feeling and choosing rather than relying on the Spirit. And a person who is a carnal or a fleshy believer, they're a person who believes God, so they are going to heaven. They've placed their faith in Christ, but they're continuing to live out of their old coping tools. And if we choose to do that, we cannot live out of the power of the Spirit. What we end up doing is being restricted in our life to responding out of the power of the soul or the body. And everything overcomes the soul or the body. We have limited resources when we do this. And there's something that keeps us keeps us away from the Spirit of God, which is our life, and it's called in the Old Testament the veil. Now, in the Old Testament tabernacle, there was a veil. It was about the thickness of a man's hand. It hung between the holy place and the Holy of Holies. And that veil represented the nearness of God, because he was just on the other side of the curtain, but his distance, because you couldn't go in there, you'd die. Okay? So the veil was both the nearness of God and his distance. And we are separated from the presence of God in a very functional way when we live as fleshly believers by this thing called the veil. Now, what is the veil? In this, well, obviously it was what happened to the veil? Let me ask you that. What happened to the veil when Jesus was crucified? Okay? It was torn in two. So that's the Old Testament pattern. That's the Old Testament picture. What does that picture in the New Testament? Well, the veil in the New Testament signifies the old man, the old Adam nature. Okay? The old nature that we got from Adam is what the old man is. And the veil for a non-believer is this old nature that keeps us separated from God. Now, the question then is, okay, well, if I'm a believer, what has happened to the old man? There's a big debate in theology circles. Romans 6 says that old man was crucified with Christ. He died on the cross. Christ took the old human nature to the cross. He took our nature on himself, and he went to the cross. And so the old man is dead. So if a person is in Christ and they are a new creation, then the old man is dead, which means in reality the veil is torn in half. The problem that we have is, what is it that we reconstruct that keeps us separated from God in terms of our daily practice? What is it that we put back up that then in a very functional way, even though God is here, he's our life, we can't access him because of something that we're reconstructing? And what it is simply our old ways of coping, feeling, and choosing. A person who is a believer and yet relying on their old coping tools is a torn person. Because on the one hand, they have the life of Christ in them, and on the other hand, they have all of their old coping tools from their old way of life that they're still relying on. It's like having an old dead friend that you continue to talk to. You continue to trust. You continue to share all your heartfelt desires to, all of the needs that you have, but they're dead. And we continue to rely on the old coping tools. And so in a very real way, because even though the old man is dead, because we are relying on those old ways of coping, feeling, and choosing, what we call in the abiding life the residue, the leftover stuff. The old guy's dead, but his stink still hangs around. There are still things that we choose to function in because that's what we did. That's Laban's idols that couldn't do anything for us, but we keep hauling them around with us. That is the old man. And even though it's dead, we continue to rely on it. And whenever we choose to rely on it, we effectively put this thing back up. Not because God does it, but because we've done it. You cannot be trusting two things at once. You can't be trusting God and trusting this idol over here at the same time. You can't hold on to both things. You have to let go of one in order to have the other. So a person here, this person here is a believer who is going to heaven. They have Christ's life in them, but they're living in hell on earth right now because they're not allowing Christ to live his life out of them. Does that make sense? So the way that idols work is that we reconstruct this thing, and then we begin to trust it. And then we cry and whine to God whenever our idols fail us, and not knowing all along God is intent on letting all those idols fail us so that we have to take them down and rely on him. So the question we want to deal with right now is, what are the things that are your idols? What are the things that you and I turn to rather than Christ in order to deal with our problems? Oops, this is the wrong picture. That's the picture we want. For every hurt you have, you're going to have a coping tool. you're going to have some response every time you have a hurt. And so, let's say that you're rejected. You experience rejection. My bet is that many of your 5 worst hurts, for many of you, included some level of rejection. You didn't do enough. Criticism. Especially if you've done your best. And then you're criticized and rejected, and you're a child, goes all over you, sticks with you for the rest of your life to some degree. Now, the interesting thing is, we can have these events that happened to us in the past, and right now today, at 55, I can have an event that feels very much like when I was 5 years old or 10 years old. I mean, life has a way of just keep serving the same thing up over and over and over again. So when life serves you up some more rejection, or at least that's the way you're interpreting it, whenever life serves you up, someone lies about you, doesn't tell the truth about you, and it's someone you put your trust in, okay? Every time you have a hurt, you're going to have a response. And you have one of 2 responses. There aren't more than 2. There are just 2 responses. This is a symbol for God. You will either look to God and find in Him what you need in that moment to deal with the hurt, or you'll pull the veil back. See, the veil's pulled because Christ is our life, and we have access to the Father. Or, in an act of self-protection, you'll pull the veil, you'll dip back into the old residue of the old man, and you'll begin to cope with your idols or your coping tools. We all do it. And the freedom, part of the thing that leads us to freedom in this is recognizing the pattern that we have. I have a very specific pattern. I'm not going to share it with you. It's pretty private, but what I've found is I'm kind of boring. I tend to do the same thing over and over and over for the last 40 years. I have the same basic pattern to responses to bad things that happen unless I make a choice to do something different. So you're either going to turn to God or you're going to turn to a coping tool. Now, what are the coping tools or what are the idols that are unique to you? I'm not going to have you stand up and share your personal ones, but what I do want to do is kind of let's make a list. What are some of the coping tools that we turn to? 20th century America, you know the culture, you're a part of it. What are some of the coping tools that we turn to in order to deal with the hurts other than Jesus? Okay, alcohol. Anyone else? Huh? Power, okay. Okay, kind of another form of power. Okay, people pleasing. Anyone else? Okay, media, addictions. Anyone else? Sex. It's a big one. It's a tough one because it meets our needs on several different levels for men and women. At least it masks meeting our needs. And so it becomes an addiction for many, many people. By the way, men tend to have physical issues with sex more. Women tend to have fantasy issues with sex more, but it's fantasy either way. And it really becomes a powerful addiction for people. Anyone else? Okay. Spending money, going shopping. Anyone else? Good. Withdrawal. Okay. This one is a big problem for me because I'm bored about half the time. And I'm just wanting to escape stress. So I stand in front of the refrigerator and stare at things I'm not really even hungry for. Anyone else? Okay. Depression. Why is depression an idol? Huh? Okay. Okay. Now, understand there are physical ramifications that contribute to depression, so you don't want to demonize depressed people. But here's the truth. Most depression is anger gone inward. Most depression starts with anger and not being able to fix something. Now, there are physical things that lead to depression. I'm not disallowing that. But 90% of the people that struggle with depression, it starts with anger over stuff they can't fix. and it just starts going inward, and then it begins to develop physical things along with it. Okay? Anyone else? By the way, depression is an interesting thing. I've been through 2 or 3 really serious bouts of depression. I tend to be kind of a moody, cynical person by nature if I'm not careful. And I was really depressed. Not long after we moved here to Ardmore, I was depressed real depressed. Mostly because I was angry, but then it began to catch up with me physically too. I was depressed for about, 4 or 5 months. Drove my wife crazy. And at first she was trying to comfort and encourage me. And finally, after a couple months of it, she finally asked me a question one day. She said, "Aren't you tired of being depressed?" You know what I said? No. Which, as it came out of my mouth, it sounded really stupid. Because it's fatiguing to be depressed all the time. And I realized I need to make some choices here. Okay? Anyone else? Let me just go down the list. There are 3 different classifications for idols. Okay? There's the C class. And the lower the higher the letter, the harder they are to deal with as idols. The C class idols are like drinking and drugs and that kind of stuff. Those are the C class idols. Things like unacceptable things like sex and drugs and alcohol and violent outbursts of temper and all that kind of stuff. Those are the C class. Then you've got the B class kind of idols. And the B class kind of idols are things that we actually see as acceptable ways of coping with life. We make excuses for them, in other words. Most people don't make excuses for outbursts of anger and that kind of stuff. We may try to justify it, but we don't make an excuse for it. But we do make excuses for things like withdrawal, depression, pouting, getting addicted to video games, arguing all the time. Sports becomes an idol. Hunting, shopping, eating. These are things that fall into kind of a B class acceptable, and they're difficult to deal with because we don't really call them what they are. We tend to make excuses for them. The A class are actually the most dangerous because they're the ones that we actually praise. So, for instance, some of the A class ones are titles, getting multiple degrees. Anything wrong with getting a degree? Anything wrong with getting multiple degrees? Well, it depends on why. If you're getting multiple degrees to feel better about yourself, it's become an idol. There's nothing wrong with improving yourself as an individual, but it all depends on how and why you're doing it, what your heart is in the pursuit. Achievement and advancement is something that we praise, something we want all our kids to experience, but it can become an idol, ladder climbing and having value because you get this promotion and because you go to the next rung in terms of your economics. That kind of achievement can be a huge idol, and it's very difficult to deal with because it's so highly praised in our culture, even in the church. Ministry is an idol for a lot of people because in working for God and working really hard, they feel really good about themselves. Anything wrong with ministry? No. But if you're doing ministry to feel better about yourself, it's become an idol. And eventually ministry will fail you. I'll tell you what will happen in ministry. Eventually God will navigate someone into your life to minister to that you just can't stand. They just drive you nuts. Or you pour your heart into helping them, and they turn around and just ignore you. Or they make some improvement, and then you go out and you find them back under the bridge over here. You know, you went to rescue a person, and you turn around and they're back under the bridge, and they've just walked away from all of your great help. And you'll find pretty quickly that if ministry is your idol, it will collapse underneath you. Knowledge is an idol. For a lot of Christians, Bible knowledge becomes an idol. In fact, Paul says that it's a huge danger for Christians because knowledge does what? Knowledge puffs up. Love edifies. So it becomes an idol. I'll tell you the one, and if you know me, if you've been around Christ Community very long, you probably know this story. Probably one of the biggest idols that God had to deal with in my life was the idol of worship. Now, most people, no matter where I'm in the world, when I say worship can be an idol, they say, what are you talking about? Worship that is truly God-directed, you're not doing it to get anything out of it. You're doing it because of who He is, and it doesn't matter what comes back your way. And I was a worship leader when I first came here. I first started leading worship when I was actually before Norman, but then I was the worship pastor in Norman, and God just did cool things. I mean, it was really pretty amazing. There was some, I don't use the word anointing a lot, but there was something unusual. And so when I came here, I was the worship leader here. And in the first few years of us living here in Ardmore, I don't remember this, Bud, but we were asked, our worship team and I as the worship leader was asked to go to other churches and kind of help them do worship things. And it was pretty heady stuff, and God was clearly using me in an unusual way, and I loved being a worship leader. I mean, I just absolutely loved it. And didn't realize the place that it was having in my life because I, to the best of my understanding, I was just giving myself to the Lord and giving Him praise. And then I lost my voice one summer. I don't know what it was. Went to doctors, got shots, I took medicine. Nobody could figure out why I lost my voice. And this thing went on for 6 weeks. I don't know if you remember that. It went on for like 6 weeks. And I got frustrated and I got angry, and it looked like I was going to have this voice thing for the rest of my life. And after about 6 weeks, I was so angry. I was pounding on the floor and yelling at God, and because I didn't know who I was anymore. My whole identity was wrapped around being a worship leader. Like it happened yesterday. And after my little temper tantrum, in which my wife looked at me like, what are you doing? After my little temper tantrum, the Lord spoke to my heart and He said, Tim, that's not who you are. You're not a worship leader. You're my son. And you have made something that you do into something that you are. And the deception is that it's supposed to be oriented toward me. It's a really good thing. But you've lost sight of the point. And so the goal in understanding ourselves and to understanding what are the coping tools that we tend to turn to. What are the coping tools that you tend to turn to? What I want you to do is just take a minute or two right now to jot down for yourself, if you haven't already filled in all the blanks, or maybe circle one that you... What are the coping tools that you in your heart know you tend to run to? We're not going to share them. I'm not going to talk to anybody else about them. But just right now for a second, ask yourself, what are the coping tools? Because those coping tools are like the reins that the enemy gets a hold of. You're the horse, and the way that you control a horse is with reins. And the enemy would love to ride you. And the way that he rides us, the way that he controls us, the way that he gets a hold of us, the reins are the coping tools, the idols that we tend to run to. So for yourself, just think through, what are the things that I might tend to turn to, maybe even good in themselves, but I turn to them to feel better about myself and the situation. Take just a second to do that.